Hello, my name is Agata Paszke and I am a graduate student of philosophy at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. It is my utmost pleasure to present to you this series of interviews with Professor Michael Devitt, a distinguished professor of philosophy at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Over the years, Professor Devitt has published numerous books and articles, most notably on issues in philosophy of language, metaphysics, and philosophy of biology. These interviews, conducted during Professor Devitt's visit to Krakow in November 2024, center around three topics. The first one concerns Professor Devitt's philosophical development and the origins of his ideas, beginning with some early reflections from the time preceding his post-secondary education, for undergraduate and graduate training, all the way to the early period of his career which followed the completion of his PhD studies at Harvard University. The second topic concerns realism and naturalism, two guiding principles not just of Professor Devitt's metaphysics, but of the entirety of his philosophical thought. Issues concerning language, broadly construed, constitute the third topic. By discussing some of these key themes from Professor Devitt's philosophy, we strove to connect his ideas regarding many philosophical problems, often seemingly far removed from one another, whilst also acknowledging the crucial changes which occurred between his subsequent theoretical proposals. Without further ado, here is our conversation. Enjoy. I think it is appropriate to start with a fairly basic question. How did you first get into philosophy?
Yes. Well, I think it would be true to say that I was always interested in philosophy, virtually out from the very beginning. I just seem to have been born into the world skeptical, and so early on there were sort of famous events in my family which upset everyone. I was told about Santa Claus, and when I was 3, as people typically were in those days, and you were told it as if it was true, not as a nice, enjoyable fable, and I said something like the 3-year-old equivalent of, "You've got to be kidding." And this upset the whole family, because I was utterly scornful of this, and I had similar attitudes to talk of God and so on. So I was, right from the beginning of my life, I was always really looking skeptically at things and very much involved in trying to figure out how the world worked. And the really important move to proper philosophy, I guess, started when I was at my English public school, Bradfield College in Berkshire, and I read in a class I was doing. I was able to choose a book to read, and I chose Bertrand Russell's Problems of Philosophy. So that was the first book I read, and that absolutely enchanted me. And I was at this point, I suppose, 17, and I then arranged to study more philosophy, which the school was wonderfully flexible in allowing you to do this. And so the second book I read was Freddie Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic, which I was also fascinated by. So I had already all that at my English public school, and I was totally enchanted by philosophy, but I also had the problem of having to go out into the world and earn a living. So for complex reasons which we can move over, I did not go straight. In fact, I didn't have even any idea that I could organize my life so that I could become a philosopher. So I had to go to work to support myself, and it was only while I was working and supporting myself, and I was now back in Australia, in Sydney, that was where I was working, that I became aware that at Sydney University you could be an evening student. And so I, after 2 or 3 years of working, for 4 years of working, I started going to university at night, Sydney University, and working all day, going at night. And I was just swept away. I thought, God, this is how much I missed philosophy, because I hadn't done it since, and how much this really enchanted me. And so I threw myself into it with enormous enthusiasm. Even though I was going every night it was like going home to go to university and mix in there.
Well, it's great to hear that you sort of fostered that attitude of curiosity in you, and I think it seems only fitting considering how much work you've done in metaphysics and philosophy of language that you started with Russell, right?
Yes.
And problems of philosophy.
Right.
Even though, of course, you're a very famous critic of Russell. So you began your formal education at University of Sydney, as you mentioned. What can you tell us about the intellectual climate there in the 1960s?
Yes, I began in '62. Well, I loved the intellectual climate. One of the things that was very good about the department, and I think this is pretty common in Australian university departments and probably lots of other ones, was the sense of a social community. So the faculty and all the bright students all mingled together in a social situation. We would just socialize together. That's the key thing. And in important things like there would be philosophy camps where you'd go off into the country, or the bush as we say in Australia, and people would stay in huts and you would have philosophy, and it would be organized by the students, the bright students, who would be the senior bright students, but the faculty would come, a lot of them, and there would be philosophy all day, and there'd be partying and drinking all night, and it was just a wonderful atmosphere. I went my first year, when of course I knew nothing very much, but it was the way I began to get really into philosophy, not just attending classes, being part of this community. And I remember, might go on to something about the atmosphere. Apart from this community of people, there was what I later saw was a really helpful attitude in this department. These were the times, '62, when philosophy in the English-speaking world, possibly not so much in America, but certainly in Australia and England, was dominated by two related currents, Wittgensteinianism and ordinary language philosophy, so-called Oxford philosophy at that time. And what was good about Sydney was that it was not dominated by this, that even though my teachers were mostly Oxford educated, they'd sort of come out unscathed from that experience, and they were at least uninfluenced by a lot of the ordinary language thinking, and often quite critical. And a very important figure in my very early times here was John Mackey, who was an extraordinarily sharp and brilliant person. And he was a severe critic of ordinary language philosophy and of Wittgenstein. And one of my most vivid early experiences was at one of those philosophy camps I mentioned, which I think there'd be one every year, and I think this was probably in my second year. And he sort of challenged the local Wittgensteinian, whose name was Bill Ganane, to have a discussion about Wittgenstein. So here the two of them are at this philosophy camp out in the bush, and John Mackey opens the philosophical investigation as if at random and reads out a passage and then sets to work on it. And Bill Ganane is there representing the Wittgensteinians trying to deal with this, which he did with, even though he had was wonderfully fluent, he was quite clear to me, and this was quite influential, it was quite clear to me who was winning this. And this was an important move for me away from the Wittgensteinian ordinary language philosophy. Yeah.
Right. So, well, you mentioned Mackie as a key figure in your
Yes.
early development, and I would like to talk a little bit about somebody else that you actually mentioned in your forthcoming book, namely Charles Martin, who you say that he foreshadowed Donald's distinction between referential and attributive uses of definite descriptions and encouraged you to sort of pursue your interest in philosophy of language. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, well, actually, that happened. So we've sort of skipped over a lot of the influences that came to me much earlier at Sydney, which we might go back to, I guess, like Australian materialism and so on. Because Charlie came to Sydney when I had already graduated. So he came, I think, 66, and I graduated in 65. And Charlie was giving courses on the philosophy of language. And I, at that point, was a graduate student, or postgraduate as they call them in Australia. I was a postgraduate student in philosophy, having finished my BA. And so I was hanging around, attending courses that interested me, and Charlie was talking about language, and particularly about names and definite descriptions. And he basically articulated the distinction that Donald later became famous for. Charlie was not a person who published much, and so this, along with a lot of his other thoughts at that time, was never published. But I just remember his lectures very vividly. So when I later went to Harvard, and I didn't read Donald until I got to Harvard, because his first paper, you remember, was 1966. It wasn't in a way new to me, because I'd already heard it from Charlie.
Right. So let's go back to that, the influences that you sort of mentioned in passing, Australian materialism, for instance.
Right.
What can you tell us about that? 'Cause
Yes.
that's very interesting.
So, one of the topics that was terrifically dominant in those early 60s in the English-speaking world was the philosophy of mind. And it was dominated by Wittgensteinian views of the philosophy of mind, which are, I mean, one's not allowed to say this, but are basically behaviorist. But it was in Australia dominated more by Ryle, who, of course, wrote a terrific book, The Concept of
Mind.
The Concept of Mind. Terrific book. I read the book and loved it, which doesn't mean to say I believed it, but it was in this atmosphere of Rylean ordinary language philosophy that Australian materialism burst on the scene, and I was there at the bursting of it. First of all, of course, before I got into philosophy, there was Smart, J.J.C. Smart, who wasn't in Sydney, he was in Adelaide, but his influence was already spreading around Australia. And one person who was influenced by this is David Armstrong. David Armstrong came to Sydney as professor in 1964, I think, and he was about to publish this big volume, The Materialist Theory of the Mind, which was the most complete statement of what became known as, well, sometimes it was known as Australian materialism and sometimes as the identity thesis. And this discussion around that David was creating was very exciting, and for me, perhaps the beginning of the major excitement of this was in 1964, soon after David had arrived at Sydney. There was the annual conference of the Australian philosophers, the Australasian philosophers, took place in Brisbane, and it was the focus of the whole conference was on what was called the identity thesis, which was a sort of Smart Armstrong type view of the mind. I drove up. Because I'd been working, I actually had the money to have a car, and I drove to that conference with 5 of my fellow students, which was pretty unusual in those days. And it's a long drive. It's about 550 miles, and we drove and arrived in Brisbane for this conference. And it was an extremely dramatic event for me, because it was a coming out of Australian materialism. It was like Martin Luther nailing his, whatever it was he nailed to the door. And the front man for this was Brian Medlin, who, front man for the materialists, and he did this absolutely magnificent presentation, provocative, in-your-face presentation, in a somewhat jocular way, but uncompromising dismissal of the Rileyan, ordinary language, Wittgensteinian thing. It was quite shocking. I can still remember the ripples as he stood. He was a very charismatic figure with long black hair, which he threw back like this, and he strode around looking at the audience and just putting it out there. And so the conference was mostly concerned with people replying to it. You know, Peter Herbst, who was a leading Australian philosopher and in the English tradition, he was quite shocked by all of this, and he had 2 papers in this conference responding to this. And then there was Gunnar, who from Melbourne, and Gunnar was a really unreconstructed Wittgensteinian, and he also replied, and they were really shocked by all this and quite dismissive. They thought Australian materialism was just crass. They're all that for it. The proceedings of this conference, by the way, were gathered together in a volume called The Identity Thesis, edited by Presley. Anyway, this was a very exciting conference for me as a student, and it was quite clear to me who had the arguments here. And so, in a way, I was liberated by this experience from the either behaviorist or quasi-behaviorist theories of the mind that were coming out of England at that time.
Well, definitely the sort of your crusade against behaviorism is a very important theme of your work, because in one of your later books you mentioned that behaviorism, I think I'm quoting it correctly, but maybe I'm just paraphrasing, behaviorism seems like just another dogma of empiricism.
Yes.
So it seems that definitely influenced you.
Yes. Right. I simply took on board very, very solidly. I don't think I myself did anything very significant at all against behaviorism. I just took on board the anti-behaviorist, the anti-behaviorism that I was being educated in, really. And of course, if let's look forward a bit to what you're going to be asking me about Harvard. Well, of course, then I go to Harvard, and of course, Quine was a behaviorist. So that's we'll put that aside. Yes, but I certainly came out of Sydney with not a behaviorist bone in my body. Yeah.
So I also want to ask you about one thing concerned with Australian philosophy, because in the introduction to Putting Metaphysics First, you mentioned John Hyles' remark in which he suggested that, Australia, for many years at least, seemed to have been a sort of a safe haven for realists, where they could sort of flourish and gather their thoughts and work on those issues. Did you have that kind of experience?
Yes, yes, I loved what John had to say, because he just remarked that at a time when we're talking the 70s into the 80s, where anti-realism seemed to dominate the airwaves of analytic philosophy. He rightly remarks that in Australia was sort of an exception to this, because realism seemed very strong in Australia. When I was an undergraduate, I don't remember it ever being an issue. The whole atmosphere just took realism for granted. Historically, perhaps, this wasn't true in Melbourne, let me just say. So, but in Sydney, the tradition probably goes back before I came to John Anderson, who was a legendary figure in Sydney, and indeed in Australia as an intellectual, though his influence outside Australia has not been significant at all, so far as I know. And he was totally realist, and his students all were totally realist. For example, David Armstrong, John Mackey, these are all students of Anderson. So that was the whole atmosphere there. And the people who influenced me, a person who became a dear friend of mine and influenced me was Graham Nerling. And all of these people just were totally realist. We didn't discuss it. It was just the background assumption. I didn't start discussing realism till the 70s, when I was suddenly shocked to discover anti-realism everywhere. But in that period of my undergraduate life in Sydney, I don't remember anti-realism coming up as a problem or something we need to worry about.
Right. So you then moved on to study at Harvard University, and you completed your PhD there. That must have been quite a change. What were your first impressions?
Yes, it was a change, and I should mention that it was a pretty radical thing to do. I was the first Australian to go to do a PhD in America in philosophy. All the Australian students who wanted to go on in philosophy all went to England in those days. They'd been doing it for ever since the war. So all my teachers, like David Armstrong, Graham Nerling, they'd all gone to Oxford. So I broke that pattern, and I broke that pattern from several reasons, but one was that a lot of Australians went to England because they regarded England as home, as it were, because it was where we'd all sort of come from. Well, for me it wasn't home, because I don't know, I'd been brought up there, so I was familiar with it already, and I was actually pleased not to be in England any longer. But the other really important thing that took me to Harvard was Charlie Martin. At the time that I was trying to figure out where to go, because I'd only recently completed my undergraduate degree, so we're talking probably the beginning of 1966, and I was wondering what was I going to do. I wasn't attracted, as I said, with the idea of going to Oxford. I was hearing bad reports of what it was like for students at that point, and what was I going to do? And I was talking to 2 or 3 other students about this problem in the cloisters at Sydney University, and Charlie Martin came up and listened to the conversation and said, when there was a pause in the conversation we were having, he said, "Harvard." He was American, though and he was a man of few words, but everyone knew that when Charlie spoke, you had to ask him questions to encourage him to say more. So I said, "Oh, Charlie, so you think I should go to Harvard? Why is that?" And Charlie said, "'Cause it's the best goddamn department in the world." And that's how I went to Harvard.
Well, that's a convincing reason to go.
and he was right. He was right. I mean, it was an amazing place to go. While I was there, I was taught by 6 people who are now in the top 20 or 30 of the most influential philosophers of the last 200 years. So it was an amazing place to go. I found it just incredibly stimulating. So I moved from a place where I think I got a wonderful education to another place where I got just this fabulous education. And the most dramatic early thing that happened to me at Harvard within a week of getting there just about was I went to Kripke's class. And now we all knew about Saul at that point, but we knew of him as this brilliant modal logician, revolutionized logic when he was barely out of high school. But I don't think anyone else knew of him as a philosopher, and he hadn't really made his mark at all. but he was giving lectures, a course, to undergraduates on language. It may have been called Naming and Necessity. I can't remember what it was called. But anyway, in this class, he delivered lectures which later developed into the classic book, Naming and Necessity. And I was absolutely bowled over by these lectures because I've already mentioned that I had started getting very interested in language at Sydney as a result of the influence of Charlie Martin. And I had read all the literature of the 50s and into the 60s on singular terms, on names and definite descriptions. And so I knew what the status quo was. And here was this astonishingly radical view with two outrageously brilliant ideas from Saul. The negative idea of what I call the ignorance and error arguments, showing that the description theories just can't be true because most competent speakers just simply do not associate, we're talking the description theory of names, most speakers do not associate, are too ignorant of the world, of the bearer to associate identifying descriptions. Or else they associate descriptions which are wrong and apply to other things. It was such a wonderfully simple and such overwhelmingly convincing argument, I thought. So that was, of course, the negative idea. And then the positive idea, again, which the full impact of this, it seems to me, has not been grasped by the people who study language. I mean, particularly a lot of linguists haven't grasped it, the idea of reference borrowing. How is it possible that we can all, however ignorant we are, we can all use the name Cicero to refer to Cicero? Well, Saul's brilliant idea was it's because of a chain of communication involving reference borrowing right back to the people who first used the name. Well, that was an absolute breakthrough for me. And right in those early days, another wonderful thing that happened to me at the beginning was I met Hartree Field, my fellow student. And we were both, though this course was an undergraduate course, we were sitting in, or in fact he may have been taking it, I think, and there were a number of other graduate students sitting in. And I just got talking to Hartree about this, and it was just incredibly helpful to work things out and talking to Hartree, because he's really so insightful and so really smart. So right within days of getting there, I heard all this. I was so excited by it. I became a bit of a laughing stock among my fellow students because I was so enthusiastic about this. And I decided probably within a month that this is what I was going to take Saul's picture and develop it into a dissertation. I was particularly zoning in, of course, on Saul had all this wonderful idea about reference borrowing, but that left us with the issue was how did the original users of the name, the ones from whom we're borrowing the reference, how did they refer? How did it all reference get started, as it were? And Saul didn't have a great deal to say about that, and that's what I wanted to zone in on. And so that's what I settled on. In about a month or two, I would write my dissertation on that, and also combining it with the stuff I got from Charlie Martin, now in print from Donnellan, the distinction between referential and attributive definite description. So that's within weeks of being at Harvard, at least a month or two, I'd already sort of got a whole thesis project.
So was that the point when you decided theory of reference, that's where that's going to be my focus for the dissertation or in the coming years?
Yes. I didn't, of course, start on as you say, my dissertation was at that point more than a year off, yes. Yeah.
But of course you wrote it under the supervision of Quine.
Yes.
And that's also another interesting and very influential figure for you. So when epistemological topics loom, you always say that you take your naturalism after Quine. In fact, and here's a quote from Coming to Our Senses, you say that, well, there's only one way of knowing, the empirical way that is the basis of science, right? So what were the main influences of Quine on your thought? And perhaps was there any other figure who influenced you with that sort of naturalistic outlook?
Right. Yes. At Sydney, I'd read quite a lot of Quine, word and object stuff, but it was all the stuff about language, particularly referential opacity and that sort of stuff. I hadn't sort of absorbed Quine's naturalism. But at Harvard, again, probably in my first semester or my second semester, I sat in on another undergraduate course, and this was given by Hilary Putnam, who was a brilliant teacher. And it was a course on epistemology. And so he ran through the familiar history of epistemology, through the figures in modern philosophy, and I think through to the positivists maybe. And then, so he'd sort of set up the whole skeptical problematic, which had so dominated modern philosophy. And then, in a way that Hilary was just so brilliant at this, in a few deft strokes, he introduced the Quinean picture. And I think if I've ever had a road to Damascus experience in philosophy, it was hearing Putnam present in this vivid way the Quinean picture that epistemology had to be naturalized. In fact, all of philosophy had to be naturalized. I think I was a convert waiting for this. You know, that is, I'd been bothered all my philosophical career by all this talk of the a priori. It just troubled me, and I remember as an undergraduate. And then suddenly, when I heard Hilary in these lectures, I felt just liberated from what I saw, and at that point, my view of philosophy changed to the Quinean view, and my view of epistemology. So that was really a philosophical, life-changing experience. Of course, when I heard Hilary this lecture, I then went back and read Quine on his presentation of naturalism. And yes, I've never looked back on that. You're absolutely right. This was enormously formative to me. But if you're looking for the influence of Quine, that's what influenced me from Quine. And I was influenced by a lot of his work on language, but not the fundamental stuff, because the fundamental stuff was, of course, his famous inscrutability of reference, the indeterminacy of translation, which in my Harvard years was all the talk. So we all spent quite a lot of time on all this, but I never believed that. I never followed Quine in any of this, and I came to see it, as a lot of people did, I think, as really arising from some unacceptable sort of verificationism and behaviorism. So I didn't follow Quine at all in the fundamental attitude, and of course, basically an anti-mentalist. You know, in word and object, the theory of mind is dealt with in half a page. You know? So I never went down that path. But then, of course, the odd thing is that I then ended up writing my dissertation under Quine. And this is really quite anomalous, because what I wrote on was, as I said earlier, I wanted to develop a causal theory of reference inspired by Saul, but putting it all in a naturalistic framework, which of course Saul didn't approve of at all. And I had to find an advisor, and this was a real struggle for just about all of my fellow students, who to get to advise you, because there were lots of brilliant teachers at Harvard, but not too many reliable advisors. And I thought of Hilary Putnam, that he was notoriously unreliable. Hartree chose Hilary, and that sort of worked out for Hartree. But I chose Quine, which hardly anyone did. Hardly anyone did. I think people were frightened of Quine because he was a sort of very formidable figure and rather well, he just didn't, he wasn't warm and cuddly. And, but I had got on okay with him in social situations, and he was, even though he seemed in a way a totally unsuitable person to advise me on my dissertation, in that I'm writing about the theory of reference, and yet Quine was notoriously a deflationist about reference, and so from his perspective there wasn't any place for a theory of reference, but nonetheless he was just very generous, and he didn't fight against my theory of reference. In fact, he gave me constructive criticisms all the way through. He was an admirable advisor, and also terribly reliable in a way that advisors at Harvard weren't those days. He would tell me, when I submitted something to him, he would tell me the day on which he would give me comments, and he always did. So that's how I ended up with Quine, yeah.
That's fascinating, because at that time some of his most prominent works have been coming out. The Roots of Reference, for example, right, which is a very important book by Quine. You must have, I guess, read some earlier drafts of it?
I don't think so, no.
Oh.
I'd left Harvard before Roots of Reference came out, and I may have read it, but I don't. I mean, I'd really gone through. I can't exaggerate how much we all at Harvard were struggling with Quine's indeterminacy of translation, right, inscrutability of reference, ontological relativity. And by the time I'd finished at Harvard in the end of '70, I sort of didn't want to go back to that.
Okay.
Word and Object, remember, had come out in 1960. It took quite a while for people to digest this and for it to become such a source of debate. But by the end of the 60s, everyone was talking about it. And Quine, you'll remember, at the end of the 60s, published an important paper, I think, in the Journal of Philosophy on the reasons for indeterminacy, I think. And that was a very succinct paper. So we were all terribly engaged with this. But I felt I had gone through that.
So, well, from what you're saying, the sort of intellectual climate at Harvard was quite different from what you experienced in Australia, what you had experienced in Australia before your studies at Harvard. So there, interesting polemics, I guess, have been going on, right, with, for instance, Quine and you and people, and Kripke and
Yes,
early Putnam,
yes.
Who obviously held, I guess, similar views to yours, for instance, from The Meaning of Meaning, which is, I think, 1975, if I'm not mistaken.
78. No, 75.
75.
You're right. Yeah. Yes,
I think.
yes. Very good. Very good. Sorry. Yes.
It's always tough to remember the dates.
No, but
I'm
you're
trying
very
to,
good at it.
I'm trying to keep track.
Yeah. No, that's right.
So I guess you must agree with many of his points from that paper, right?
Yes. Yes, I do agree with many and disagree with quite a few too. But of course, that was all after I left Harvard.
Absolutely.
While I was there, I've already mentioned the impact that Putnam had on me presenting a Quinean position, which was his position until 1975, 76, when he had this radical change, which we can perhaps talk of later. But the other influence I got from Putnam at Harvard was again realism. But just like at Sydney, it wasn't something we were fussing about. It was something we almost just took for granted. But I was certainly influenced by Putnam, who already had a big reputation as a realist,
Right.
and he presented the arguments for realism quite vividly. Yeah, but so that was another influence from Putnam at Harvard. Yes.
So at that time, you also attended one of Chomsky's classes, right? And in Ignorance of Language, you give this very interesting description, very poetic, of the sort of bustling atmosphere of the linguistic departments at that time when the revolution was kind of
Yes.
going on. And well, you sort of describe that situation, and you say that, and here's a quote: "I was very impressed and still am, but I was also very puzzled." So which attitude was the prevailing one?
Right.
That of puzzlement, or perhaps that of amazement?
Right. Well, the amazement. Well, it wasn't so much amazement. I was really struck by generative linguistics, and you say I went to Chomsky's class. That's true, which was of course at MIT. But first off, I went to syntax classes, a couple of syntax classes at Harvard. Particularly, I remember the beginning for me with generative semantics was a class given by George Lakoff, who was a junior person in the linguistics department at that time. And the linguistics department at that time was not Chomskyan, was not into generative semantics, generative grammar. And this led George Lakoff to be quite dismissive of his own department. I think he referred to them as, some of them as mere philologists. He was full of the generative grammar enthusiasm, and that I found very engaging. It seemed to me to be an extraordinarily important contribution to the theory of language. But yes, at the same time that I was so excited by generative grammars, I was very puzzled by the way it was all presented. The sort of meta theory of this was that it was all about the mind. It was about mental states and so on. Whereas it seemed to me obvious that it was a theory, that grammars are a theory of language, part of the theory of language, and that language is a representational system which exists outside the mind. It's a system of symbols, noises, inscriptions, and of course lots of other sorts of signals that can be part of the outside the mind world. I saw this is sort of obvious. So what this is a theory of is the syntactic properties of symbols outside the mind. We also had to have a theory of language, also needed theories of the referential properties of these symbols. But again, what I took Saul to be presenting, and Saul himself would have obviously thought he was presenting, with theories of these proper names and natural kind term, things outside the mind. Of course, minds produce them, obviously, but they themselves are not mental. So I found this aspect of the linguistic, the revolution in linguistics very, very puzzling, this way they saw of it as all mental. And it puzzled me for years and years and years, and I didn't do much about it except worrying away at it. And I would make some comments on it when I wrote books about language, but I didn't seriously address it until 2006. Yes, but it had lingered all that time. And as a result of going to the George Lakoff's course, I got, as I was just saying, very engaged. And so I went, along with Hartree Field, who was also going to George's course, I went to a seminar that Chomsky was putting on with Bromberger at MIT, which was a short distance down the road. This became a famous seminar. That is, it went on for years and years and years, but in those days it was fairly early days. And I would go down there with Hartree and with Gareth Evans, who was a visiting postgraduate or graduate student from Oxford. And so we would go to this very lively seminar. It was my first, it wasn't my first experience of Chomsky, because my first experience of Chomsky was actually at an anti-war demonstration. But it was my first experience of him doing linguistics and philosophy.
So again, I guess the environment at Harvard must have been very sort of community-based, and
Right.
because you mentioned that when we were talking about Australia, and,
Yes.
and I wonder if that was similar.
No,
at Harvard
it was really quite different. Yes, the wonderful thing about Sydney was that there was a philosophical community at Sydney, and if you're a young student who was enthusiastic, you were immediately plunged into an environment where people were doing philosophy. They weren't just teaching you the stuff. You could see it happening. You know, there was ordinary language philosophy was being challenged, and the new theory of the mind was being, and you were part of the community that's doing it. That was very heady stuff at Sydney. At Harvard, it was pretty different. We had these wonderful teachers, but we didn't socialize with them at all, hardly. We hardly even saw them, you know. But we had, when I say we, I'm talking about my fellow graduate students, wonderful graduate students. I mean, I've already mentioned Hartree, but there were who had a particular impact on me. And Hartree and I were 3 years together at Harvard and talked all the time. And it was just, it was one of the things I really got out of Harvard. There was a community of the students.
Right.
But there was nothing like that warm social community you had at Sydney. But there were just some terrific, my fellow students, I mean, some that you would know and it became famous. Ned Block was a fellow student of mine. Alan Gibbon was a fellow student. Jeff Hellman. And God, I'm probably forgetting to mention people. But they were, and we had a really good fellowship among us. Yeah.
Also, people who inspired you, right? For instance, Hartree
Yeah.
Field's idea of partial denotation was very important to you. You mentioned it in designation,
Yes.
and then also, of course, in a recent article. Chapter.
I didn't get that. I don't think he developed that at Harvard. But what he did develop at Harvard, and I was very, very struck by this, was the ideas. He developed his wonderful paper, Paszke's Theory of Truth, which was written while we were together at Harvard. And I remember when he first started airing these thoughts to me, calling me up and drawing my attention to puzzling passages in Paszke, which he found provocative and which led him to point out that what was missing here from the theory of truth was anything that you could call a theory of reference. Right. And he developed this idea, of course, into that terrific paper. So that was very much part of my intellectual life at Harvard at the very end of being there. Yes.
Right. So, what happened after Harvard?
Yes. Well, I went back to Sydney. In a way, that's somewhat interesting because, and it's a bit shocking to the modern young philosopher when I tell them about this, because because the modern young philosopher, of course, has a terrible struggle finding a job. But it was very different in the end of the 60s. While I was still at Harvard, and I think only in my second year as a graduate student, I got offered a tenured position, not even a tenure track, a tenured position at Sydney, where I'd come from. And that was not peculiar in those days. So I responded, love to have a tenured position at Sydney, but I haven't finished my PhD yet. Can I put it off for a year or two? And they said, oh, no trouble. So when I did finish, or I hadn't actually submitted my dissertation, but it was well on the way, I went back to Sydney in '71 and of course, my first project was finishing my dissertation. But having finished the dissertation, I wanted to keep working on it and try to work it up into a book. I wanted a book, as it were, developing this Kripke-inspired, Donald-inspired, naturalistically inspired theory of reference. And I did work on that all the way through the 70s and produced Designation. But other things were going on at the same time, which had a big impact on me. Most strikingly was I found myself surrounded by people who urged anti-realism, and an intellectual climate in the world that was going particularly anti-realist. Kuhn and Feyerabend had revolutionized the philosophy of science and epistemology in, it seemed to me, a very good way. Putnam had first put me onto this at Harvard, and I was very taken with the Kuhn-Feyerabend view of the history of science and the epistemology of science, all of which was so at odds with what was then the established view, which was either positivist, or else what you might call the loyal opposition, the Popperians. So I just was swept away by the Kuhn-Feyerabend stuff. But then, along with the Kuhn-Feyerabend stuff, great stuff on epistemology and the history of science, went what I thought was a naive semantics, most strikingly naive in Kuhn, and a pretty appalling metaphysics, because what we got was a sort of relativistic Kantian metaphysics coming out of, particularly out of Kuhn. Well, I was quite shocked by that, but then found that it was actually becoming the received view. There were lots of people at Sydney who were pushing this sort of view. And at the same time, I became aware of the influence of this sort of view in continental philosophy, particularly French philosophy, so and postmodernism. So the anti-realism just seemed to be in the 70s everywhere. So I started resisting this, and as I've said before, the atmosphere I'd had at Sydney when I was an undergraduate, the atmosphere at Harvard, was just realist. We didn't talk about it, we just took it for granted. And I don't think ever have thought of defending it, because I didn't think it needed defense until suddenly I'm surrounded by anti-realists. And so I began in the mid-70s to work a lot on realism and defending it, and this led to my second book, Realism and Truth, in 1984. So that was a big impact on me and on what I did, the atmosphere of anti-realism, and world makers, as I referred to them. The other thing that happened in the 70s, which had a big impact on me, and again something I wanted to resist, was what was known as the Davidsonic boom. That is, what happened in the English-speaking world in general, and I think particularly in Oxford, was enormous influence of Davidson's view of language. And I thought one feature of the Davidson view was a dismissive attitude to theories of reference. Well, even while I was at Harvard, had resisted that and had delivered a paper defending the idea of a theory of reference from the Davidsonian view, set out, I think, in one of his influential papers in the 60s. Truth and Meaning, was it called? I think that's what it was called. Anyway, the Davidsonic boom became more and more prominent, and virtually every book that came out of Oxford was Davidsonian. So I wanted to resist that, and that played that slowed me up in publishing my theory of reference, and my development of my dissertation slowed me up in writing designation. I sort of felt I had a draft of designation around 1976 or something, but then my friends, particularly Hartree, pointed out, well, you better take account of all of this stuff, and so I did. Yeah, so I have quite a lot in designation, resisting the Davidsonic boom.
So you were preoccupied with metaphysics, and obviously a lot of very influential articles of yours came out in the 1970s and then all the way through 1980s. You mentioned your book, Realism and Truth, which of course that was the first edition, 84, and then the second edition came a few years later. So I assume that was sort of your main focus at that point, right? Well, I mean, of course, designation came out in 81, but there was a noticeable shift there.
Yeah. Right. Well, I was working very hard on this realism issue at the end of the 70s and into the 80s. But I never lost my interest in language. So your question has struck a thought with me. I'm trying to remember what. Oh, I know. I was struck with various things. Oh, here's something that was going on which really very much to do with language, and that is direct reference.
Right.
My work on reference was strictly focused on reference, and designation was focused on reference. And my earliest paper on language, singular terms, was focused on reference. But the issue of meaning naturally comes up. I didn't say much about it, but I didn't think, once you seized on the causal theory of reference, it seemed to me sort of obvious that insofar as we needed to talk about the meaning of a name, it would be, as I later put it, it would be the causal mode of reference. You've got a causal theory of reference. Well, that particular mode of, each name has its own particular mode of reference, its own particular sort of causal chain, and that's its meaning. And that I thought was just sort of obvious and didn't need to be emphasized. And so in singular terms, it goes by in one paragraph. But it actually, I found later, is regarded as quite a shocking idea. Yeah. And by the end of the 70s, notice long after Saul's work first became known, which was, after all, around 1970, by the end of the 70s and into the 80s, the received view was that if you were a Kripkean about reference, you must, if you were a Kripkean about reference and hence suppose that reference is to be explained by some sort of causal historical theory, then your view must be about the meaning, it must be that the meaning is simply the referent. And that's the direct reference view. Yeah. And so in the 80s, I got quite exercised by that because I thought this was quite wrong. So that was another thing that went on in the 80s and into the 90s and even to this day.
Yes, because some people thought that it was a natural development of Kripke's ideas. And very often you can read people's works where they write that, Kripke's direct reference picture, right?
Yes,
and
yes.
He never said that.
No, exactly. No, you're quite right. One of the baffling things, the whole history of this is really quite odd. And the view of direct reference, that is, which is a theory of meaning, was commonly attributed to Kripke, even though it's not something that Kripke had ever said. And when it became clear that people were attributing it to him, he denied that he had this view. But this didn't sort of have much impact. It still was, people just attributed it to him. And I was quite incensed about that too, so I argued against this. But it was a very odd development. It was, and you put it very well a minute ago, everyone thought that if you were a Kripkean about reference, you had to be a direct reference theorist. There were those who thought this was a great idea and embraced direct reference, like, for example, Nathan Salmon and Scott Soames and David Brown. But then there were the opponents who resisted all this. They took it that part of the reason they resisted the causal theory was because they took it to be committed to direct reference. But it wasn't committed to direct reference at all.
So there was a lot at stake during that time, direct reference. Davidsonians, right, as you mentioned. Also, we could talk a little bit about Rorty, if you want, and his ideas, which obviously oppose yours, right? And well, you wrote that paper, Rorty's Mirrorless World, as a response to him. So the way I see it is these were troubling times.
Yes, yes.
Live in.
Well, philosophy is full of troubling times. It's always a troubling time, and that's really part of the excitement of it all.
Right.
And I mean, it's just I love it. It's I love the to and fro and so on. Yes. Well, the Rorty. I got involved with Rorty, but this was after the first edition of Realism and Truth. So that came out, and the Rorty stuff was in the late 80s. And yes, I found I was very interested in his book, and I had met him, and we'd had a few pointed but very friendly exchanges. I found him a very enjoyable person to have discussions with. And when I wrote Rorty's Mirrorless World, I sent it to him, and I got a delightful response from him where he criticized this, that, and the other. But what really upset him was that I had said that he was a realist, which I was regarded as a compliment, but he did not regard it as a compliment.
Yeah, so a lot of those polemics which were going on for quite a few years, they started in 1970s, 1980s with Davidson and Davidsonians, Rorty, Devitt, for instance, right? So also Devitt's Anti-Realism, which is also a paper of yours.
Yes. Yes, that certainly started in the 70s too. Well, when I got on this defending realism kick at the end of in the 70s, I mean, what particularly, there were various things that really exercised me. I've already mentioned the Kuhn Feyerabend stuff and the postmodernist stuff, both of which were quite present around me in Sydney. But also, I should mention perhaps the thing more than anything else that drove me to start defending realism and tackling the issue was my old teacher, Putnam. Because Putnam, who had been one of the people who, I didn't get my realism from him, I'd always been a realist, but I liked the shape of his realism, the way he argued for it when I was a graduate student at Harvard. And suddenly he, all in a year, he gave up realism and turned to this new sort of view, which he published in Meaning and the Moral Sciences. Isn't that, what was it called? Meaning, and I've forgotten the name of the book. 1978 book, anyway.
Okay.
And I was so exercised by that book that I wrote, in fact, 2 critical notices of it. One in the AJP and I think one in Noose. It was a dramatic change for Putnam. He changed all in a few months. He changed from being a realist to being an anti-realist, and from being a pretty far left politically in the progressive labour movement, he became relatively conservative, and he also took up religion. all in 1 year. So it was quite a change for him, and that I found all of that quite shocking. Yes. So.
And you have been a loyal realist over the years for many years now. So
I've never
never had the idea to jump the ship.
I've never had any. It's as deep in me as atheism, naturalism, realism. Yeah. If I lose that, you might as well put me out and shoot me. I think, yes.